Hello, thank you for joining today's webinar, Putting the Brakes on Water Pollution, a story of industry and government collaboration for copper-free brakes. Audio is available for this presentation through your computer's mic and speakers or by telephone. Your call-in number can be found by clicking the upward arrow by the mute/unmute button in the Zoom control panel across the bottom of your screen. After you click the upward arrow, choose Switch to phone audio, and then follow the instructions provided. All attendees have been muted to minimize background noise. This webinar will be recorded. If you have a question during the presentation, please type into the question box on the bottom of your screen in the Zoom toolbar. Questions can be targeted to a specific panelist or more broadly to all panelists. We'll hold questions until the end for a combined Q&A session. You can also enter any technical difficulties in the chat found in the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, and we will work on addressing those. With that, I will now turn it over to Rachel Urban of EPA to get us started.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Rachel Urban, the lead for the Stormwater Permits team in EPA's Office of Wastewater Management. And we're very glad that you've joined us today to hear more about our effort, our voluntary effort to reduce copper in brake pads and ultimately in stormwater and our nation's waters. So I'm joined today by several other speakers, including Lori Holmes and Lee Marino from the Motor and Equipment Manufacturers Association, Aaron Lowe from the AutoCare Association, and Don Welsh from the Environmental Council of the States. So before we launch into things, let's go over a little bit of what we've been covering in today's webinar by looking at the agenda on the next slide. Today's presentation will cover some background on how we got to the point of initiating and signing a memorandum of understanding. We'll also provide an overview of the MOU and describe the responsibilities and intentions of the signatories. Finally, we'll give updates on the status and outcomes of those responsibilities, the MOU benefits from the various perspectives, and take-home messages as well. So, and like most webinars, we've also allotted some time at the end to answer some of your questions. So on the next slide is a little bit more about the groups our presenters represent today. As you can see on this slide, our presenters include participants representing regulators, vehicle suppliers, and automotive aftermarket and automakers. Excuse me. This effort is a collaboration of all of us. And the MOU successes you'll hear about today are owed to all of us, realizing the important benefits of coming together voluntarily to look at source control and pollution prevention on a national scale to reduce copper in stormwater. Now, let me read these group descriptions. Just kidding. We added these descriptions mainly because we thought it would be good to provide additional background that you can review now while on your screen and later when we post the recorded webinar, just to understand a little bit about our different groups. So now that you've learned a little bit about us on this screen, let's move to the next slide and start with a little background on how we got to the point of working together on an MOU in the first place. So Lee of MEMA and myself will be walking through this portion of our webinar. On the next slide, let's start with a little background on copper and stormwater. So stormwater from paved surfaces, including roads, can contain a lot of different types of pollutants. And the types and amounts of pollutants vary depending on several different factors, like the size of the road, the amount and type of traffic on the road, the location or the setting, and then the types of materials and chemicals used on the road surface and in the rights of ways. The primary pollutants of concern in stormwater from roadways include, among other things, copper, lead, zinc, cadmium, chromium, nickel, and asbestos. And just a little spoiler alert, these are all things that you'll see are addressed through this voluntary effort. So while copper is an essential nutrient at low concentrations, it can be toxic to aquatic organisms at higher concentrations. And states and tribes adopt water quality criteria for pollutants like copper in order to protect the quality of surface waters. And we at EPA and our state colleagues as well were observing that some areas had high copper levels that exceeded these water quality criteria for protecting aquatic life. and therefore copper is listed as impairing water bodies around the country. And other groups, including the California Stormwater Quality Association and various environmental groups, were also taking notice and focusing more attention on the source of copper in stormwater. And one source of copper includes wearing of vehicle brake pads onto roadway surfaces when it comes into contact with stormwater and then is picked up and discharged into nearby waterways. So now that you've got a little background on the environmental concern about copper and stormwater, I'll now turn it over to Lee to provide a little bit of background on vehicle friction brake pads.
Thanks, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. You know, it might seem basic, but some people genuinely may not know what is a brake friction material. Well, in simple terms, you may have heard the phrase brake pad. So brake pad is really what we're talking about here. The formal title is brake friction materials, and that's what's used in all of the regulations and legislation. But here's a little brake 101. Most vehicles today have disc brakes on the front wheels and drum brakes on the rear, although not always, but that's typical. What you see here in the photo is a disc brake assembly. And while there are many components to the brake assembly, the main components noted here are the brake rotor, which is that silver disc, the brake caliper, which is what squeezes the rotor as the brakes are applied, and the brake pad, which is the friction material that creates the slowdown of the vehicle. When the brake pedal is depressed, a hydraulic fluid cases the caliper to press the brake against the pad, which generates friction, which converts to kinetic energy, which creates heat in the brake pad, which also burnishes small particles of the brake pad as it wears down as you use it. Brake pads are composite products which have a series of formulations for a variety of application-specific use scenarios, depending on the vehicle and the application needed. But in the end, it's a safety product. And so this is why when we approached this issue, we were very careful to make sure that we had good, solid dialogue with everybody to explain the material itself, because it does vary as a composite. So now that I've kind of gone over a little bit about what brake pads are, I'll go to the next slide and talk a little bit about why copper was used in the first place. So copper was used primarily to address brake fade, friction, thermal conductivity, and durability. Copper has other properties, of course, that are desirable, but in the end, recognizing the issues that were cropping up in California and Washington, which were evaluating the impact of copper in the stormwater runoff and identifying brake pads as one source of this of copper content in the waterways, we recognized that we needed to work collaboratively to do something about it. But again, as I noted earlier, brake pads are, as a composite, are complex. And so it's a very resource intensive process to develop and create the right composite to elicit rather the performance requirements that you're looking for, in addition to the primary one, which is safety and being able to slow the vehicle down and stop. So because of this, we recognize that a collaborative effort was needed. And I'm going to turn it over to Don Welsh with ECOS next to talk a little bit more about the progression of this process and how it played out, and how we came to a cohesive solution. So Don, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lee. Before the national MOU was developed, states developed some of the groundwork for addressing copper in vehicle brake pads. In 2010, both the states of Washington and California enacted legislation that required manufacturers of brake friction materials to phase out the use of copper and other constituents. Washington adopted a Better Brakes rule in 2012, and in 2015, industry associations, the EPA and ECOS coordinated to develop a voluntary MOU to phase out copper in vehicle brake pads nationwide. And in 2017, California adopted its brake friction materials requirements rule. Next slide. California and Washington's rules both specified legal maximums for copper as well as several other pollutants in vehicle brake pads in 5-year increments. And these are shown in percent by weight on the chart. You can see that the states have requirements that resemble each other's. For example, for copper, both states went from no required limit in 2015 to a maximum of 5% by weight by January 1, 2021, and are required to be a maximum of 0.5% by weight by January 1, 2025. Now I'll turn it back to Lee.
Thanks, Don. So again, this coordination that was sparked by California and Washington was the impetus for us to carry forward this collaboration that we had at the state level and look to what we could do on a national level to develop a voluntary memorandum of understanding. And I was fortunate and had the honor and privilege to work on this MOU with Rachel and Aaron and many of my other industry association colleagues on coming up with this MOU. But as any process, as you can imagine, as symbolized by the photo at the right, it was a long and winding road to get there. But I would say that the result was certainly a win-win for all parties. And why we're here really today is to understand more about what the MOU does. So with that, I'd like to turn it over back to my colleague, Laurie Holmes, to give an overview of the MOU. Laurie?
Yes, so now we're going to talk about the MOU. I think Rachel has that beginning of the next slide.
No problem. So now that we've shared some background, let's launch into more details of the Memorandum of Understanding itself. And you'll see on the next slide that we've pinned this effort, the Copper Free Brake Initiative. So as I said earlier in the presentation, the MOU is a cooperative effort between government and industry stakeholders. I think you can tell that just in the back and forth exchange we're having on today's webinar. And you can see in the picture there on the slide that on January 21st, 2015, representatives from EPA, ECOS, MEMA, BMC, and other key vehicle industry stakeholders signed the MOU that we're talking about today. So Laurie, I know you'll cover the last little bit of this slide, so I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so as mentioned by Dawn, in January 2015, the MOU on the Copper Free Brake Initiative was finally completed and signed by the signatories, EPA, ECOS, MEMA, BMC, AutoCare, and the other vehicle industry stakeholders. So as you probably gathered by now, the main objective of the MOU was to agree to a voluntary nationwide phase out of copper and other constituents that align with the California and Washington requirements. This was a team effort through industry and government collaboration. Industry efforts included not only the aftermarket and original equipment brake pad manufacturers, but also the aftermarket distributors and retailers. Next slide. So again, we'll go through, Don went through what was required by Washington and California, but this slide kind of outlines the timeline for the nationwide voluntary commitments outlined in the MOU. These require targets mirror the requirements for the brake friction materials in California and Washington regulations. The timeline for that A-level goal for brake friction material to contain no more than 0.1% by weight of asbestiform fibers, lead, chromium-6, and mercury, and no more than 0.01% by weight of cadmium was January 2015. And for the copper requirements, the timeline for that B-level goal for brake friction material to contain no more than 5% copper by weight was January 2021. And then the timeline for that N-level goal for brake friction material to contain no more than 0.5% copper by weight was January 2025. And I'll just note on this slide that most of those constituents mentioned here were not in brake friction material, had not been in brake friction materials for a while, but the state laws and the MOU just wanted to make clear to consumers and the general public that these constituents were no longer in brake friction materials. So now I will turn it over to Aaron from AutoCare, who will discuss what exactly the signatories committed to in the MOU beyond the copper and other constituent requirements.
Thanks, Lori. So AutoCare is very pleased. Good afternoon, everyone, first of all. And AutoCare is very pleased to have been part of this effort as an original co-signer. And as was already stated, the signatories, all of them, agreed to promote the nationwide phase out of copper and other constituents from brake friction material in accordance with the voluntary timeline, which Lori just went through, and the responsibilities noted in the MOU, which included educate and communicate on a nationwide basis the phase out of the copper and other constituents from the brake friction material, testing the brake friction material for safe alternatives, marking and labeling the friction material packaging, providing access to the registrars, publish and distribute the educational materials, and working toward achieving the MOU goals in the stated time frames. Now, later, we're going to go into some of the more specific responsibilities for each of our groups in implementing this. Every group worked together, but Lori is going to go through some of the more specifics as it relates to what we all agreed to in the MOU. So Lori, you want to take it back again?
Sure, I think, so next slide. Okay, and that's, Aaron talked a little bit about that. And then the next slide, I'll talk about, yeah, so, we've been referring to A, B, or N levels to refer to the brake friction material targets. And I will explain a little bit about that here on this slide. So many consumers have probably seen the leaf mark on brake pad packaging or the edge code marking on brake pads. Brake pads have edge code marks that indicate the level of environmental compliance with either A, B, or N levels. So edge codes were already marked on the brake prior to these regulations, but adding the compliance level to that edge code was an ideal place to add the environmental compliance mark. So for this, in this picture, in this example, B14 is B level compliance manufactured in 2014. So the leaf mark symbol for the packaging also indicates the environmental compliance marking and has a different symbol for each compliance level. A, B, or N is indicated on how many leaves and the graphic are solid. So Washington requires brake pads in the package to indicate the proof of compliance level. California does not require the leaf mark on the packaging, but does accept and recognize the leaf mark symbol. Both of these methods are discussed in the MOU to help communicate and just help be transparent as to how the brake aligns with the targets. Next slide. Okay, so the other issue that is discussed in the MOU is registrars. The registrars are required by California and Washington in the regulations, and each state uses different terms, and some of the requirements vary a little bit between states, but for the purpose of this presentation, we will use the term registrar. So what is the registrar's responsibilities? The brake pad manufacturer submits its friction materials to the registrar. The registrar certifies compliance to the California or Washington requirements and assigns a unique ID code for the formulation. Then the registrar posts compliant friction materials to a publicly available website and submits reports to the state as specified in the individual state requirements. Brake friction material manufacturers are in the end responsible for the self-certification documentation. Next slide. So earlier we touched on the responsibilities of the MOU signatories. Now each organization will touch on the work that they have done on behalf of the MOU since it was signed in 2015. And I will kick us off for MEMA and BMC. So next slide. So BMC and MEMA had various responsibilities per the MOU. The most significant was that brake manufacturers agreed to ensure brake friction materials would meet the targets nationwide, not just in California and Washington, and essentially meet the A, B, or N levels and mark appropriately, indicating the level being met with the appropriate edge code and the packaging with the leaf mark certification. So MEMA and BMC have also worked tirelessly to provide industry education and outreach to educate the public, industry, and the media about the voluntary nationwide commitments the industry has made. Now I'll turn it over to Aaron one more time with AutoCare to talk about what they've done.
Thanks, Laurie. So from AutoCare, the AutoCare Association represents the distributors and retailers of automotive parts. So we're the ones that talk to the consumer, to the independent repair shops. And our goal was to make sure, we should be on the next slide. Our goal was to educate them on understanding, first of all, what the MOU requires, and also the state laws that were in place, understanding responsibilities, and also to know what the importance of this issue to the environment. So the association did articles in our publications that went out to members. We worked with civic compliance assistants for a lot of our members to make sure they understood how they should comply with it. A lot of that entailed understanding the leaf mark education awareness that Laurie went through earlier. And we maintain the copper-free brake website, which you can see up there on the screen. And that really provides a lot of information for the industry on specific requirements of the MOU. And then finally, we have a trade show in Las Vegas that we actually co-sponsor with MEMA. It's called Apex, and it's usually the first week in November, and it's very widely attended by the industry. It's the largest auto parts trade show in North America. And we had seminars and educational information at the trade show, so that it had a widespread access to the individual members of our industry, not just AutoCare members or MEMA members, but the entire industry. So very widely, very, very successful effort to get that information out there. And now I think I'm turning it back no, I think I'm turning it over to Lee Marino, right, Lee?
That's right. Yes, that's right, Aaron.
I knew I'd get that right.
Thank you.
Lee.
Yes, it's a lot of tossing the ball to one another today. So on the next slide, the Alliance for Automotive Innovation unfortunately was not able to be with us today, but they provided these points to us to share for the MOU webinar. The Alliance for Automotive Innovation is currently representing, I think, virtually all original equipment vehicle manufacturers, new passenger vehicle and light truck manufacturers. They also represent some tier 1 suppliers and technical and tech companies. They worked very closely with us on the MOU development process because, of course, naturally, these are products that they need to brake pads they put on their vehicles as original equipment, and then they have service recommendations for replacement product as the brake pads wear out. So it was really important for them to engage with us on this and to get their members to start planning for their products down the road to begin incorporating these low and no copper brakes into their fleet. So what I'll do here is the points that they've provided in terms of what their responsibilities were is to conduct that industry outreach within their association and among their members, as well as to work with the brake friction manufacturers and collaborate both directly customer to customer, as well as through industry forums, such as through our associations or conferences and what have you. But since the MOU has been signed, automakers have continued to certainly tout the benefits of the MOU, which provides a cost-effective, consistent approach to managing the content of brake friction materials and making that change. They have worked diligently with their OE friction material suppliers to design, test, and procure brake pads that meet these MOU specifications nationwide. And they have taken this commitment very seriously, as we all have, of course. And the MOU remains very important and a useful tool in providing this coordinated approach to roll out the lower and no copper brakes in their products. And they have worked very quickly to resolve and address some supply chain challenges in the related to the COVID pandemic, but also certainly in the initial days of making sure that we were ramping up for compliance when these regulations were finalized in California and Washington. So the automakers are a huge component of this effort. And now I will turn it over to our regulatory colleagues over at EPA to talk about their role in the MOU as well. Rachel?
Thanks, Lee. So on the next slide, you can see that we've been sharing information broadly, both internally with other EPA programs and also externally with other federal partners, stormwater associations, industry and transportation groups, and even other countries. And as like a little heads up for my fellow panelists, I'm counting this webinar toward an extra, toward my list, so to speak, towards this action. So hope you're taking notes. We also created a webpage to share information on the initiative. This website's been visited over 6,400 times. And if you're counted in that number, if you're someone who's visited, thank you for your interest. In addition, we've continued to promote our effort as the federal copper-free brake initiative, which I think Lee and Aaron would agree was the most descriptive, straightforward way we could think to describe the effort. So hopefully all of you out there think so too. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Don of ECOS for the next slide.
Thank you, Rachel. ECOS is the National Nonpartisan Association of State and Territorial Environmental Agency Leaders. And an important part of the mission of ECOS is to build the capacity of those state environmental leaders to protect the environment. And through our national meetings and regular calls, ECOS provides opportunities for state environmental leaders to come together to discuss common challenges and to share their approaches and innovations to those challenges. Very frequently, some states take the lead in addressing a particular challenge, like copper and stormwater runoff, for instance. And the sharing opportunities that ECOS provides help spread the word about effective solutions and reduce duplication of effort and reinventing the wheel. Progress in reducing pollution is usually faster when we can build a solution once and then use it many times. ECOS was able to share the efforts of leading states like Washington and California and tell the story of the effective voluntary participation with manufacturers under this important MOU. This helped to promote the MOU and reduce the chance of a patchwork of approaches across different states that would present a barrier to effective implementation. Now I'll turn it over to Laurie Holmes.
Thank you, Don. Next slide. So now let's talk about the status and progress and outcomes of the MOU commitment. Next slide. So as a result of the MOU, brake friction material manufacturers have expended millions of dollars researching, developing, reformulating, testing, and certifying alternatives to copper. This was not an easy task. Brakes are a critical part of the vehicle, as it's important that they work properly. Brakes have regulatory performance standards and safety for safety, but also industry standards for durability. So this was an important process for the brake manufacturing industry to research alternative materials to successfully replace copper. So currently, brake pads across the country are aligned with those A-level requirements, having eliminated asbestos, chromium 6, lead, mercury, and cadmium. Those goals were set for January 2015. Industry is now aligned with that B-level target that were set for January 2021 of having no more than 5% copper by weight. And now we are seeing lots of early alignment within level brake pads, which is not required until January 2025. And again, that's no more than 0.5% of copper by weight. Next slide. So regarding the alignment of N level, as of late September, research on the registered brake pads, a back of the envelope calculation, that indicates that more than 75% of brake pads in the US are meeting N-level compliance, which is no more than 0.5% copper by weight. So we are very proud of being ahead of our timeline goals with copper. Next slide. So industry's anticipated future outcomes, what do we expect over the next couple of years? One, brake pad manufacturers are on track to fully meet that N level by January 2025. Two, there's ongoing outreach to aftermarket retailers and service technicians. Three, there is ongoing collaboration among all signatories. We try to meet annually to discuss progress on the MOU and the goals that are set in there. We just met back in March 2021. And then four, last, new vehicles are being designed with compliant brake pads. And it also seems like there's early evidence that copper is already decreasing in stormwater runoff. Okay, so for the next slide, I will turn it over to Rachel with EPA.
Thanks, Lori. So this initiative really has provided many other benefits beyond just the big picture environmental goals. So moving to the next slide, you can see a few benefits that we've compiled from the government perspective. You can see that it can serve as a model to be replicated for other possible voluntary approaches to address environmental concerns, especially for those that involve source control or pollution prevention type of activities. And having a national approach can really avoid some potential regulatory duplication of having to set up state by state requirements. And this can really save regulator resources of having to approach challenges individually instead of collectively as a whole. And it can also really enhance collaboration among many different groups, like you can see today on today's call, really facilitating a good way to better understand limitations and objectives, while also finding creative ways to address problems that can work for all parties. So as we switch to the next slide, I'll pass it along to Lori of NEMA now to explain some benefits from the industry perspective.
Thank you, Rachel. So what were the benefits of the MOU from the industry perspective? The most significant benefit was that there is a transparent nationwide commitment to phasing out copper in brake pads. It was extremely helpful to communicate to other state legislatures that the industry had committed to a phase out of copper nationwide, preventing a very complicated, onerous 50-state patchwork of unaligned standards, compliance deadlines, and sell-through dates. There are just a few minor differences between the Washington and California regulation, and even those small differences have caused lots of confusion. So we were very thankful that we were able to prevent a greater patchwork of regulations and copper in brakes. This helped avoid costly and complicated compliance and reduce confusion along the supply chain and other end users. And importantly, there has been enhanced communication and collaboration between industry and the government. And now I'll turn it over to Rachel again.
Back. So this really is a national level memorandum of understanding, which is a transparent way to voluntarily bring people together to address source control efforts. And in this instance, reduce stormwater pollution and improve our nation's waters. And this sort of framework also is a way to consistently address a problem while providing certainty to those who manufacture, supply, sell, and use brake pads. And as I said earlier, this effort can really serve as a model for others interested in a source control type approach for reducing pollutants and protecting the environment. So with that, I think we'll wrap up and move into the question and answer portion of the webinar, and I'll turn things back over to Zach.
Hi, thank you again for joining us for today's webinar. For more information on this initiative, including the actual MOU document, feel free to visit the URL listed on this slide. As noted at the beginning, today's webinar has been recorded and will be posted to EPA's website. Anyone registered for the webinar will receive an email notification when the recording has been posted. A link will be posted to the URL listed on this slide. And now our speakers are available to answer questions. If you haven't already entered questions, please type any questions into the questions box on the Zoom toolbar. Questions can be targeted to a specific panelist or more broadly to all panelists. We will do our best to have panelists discuss many of the questions submitted during today's session, although it's possible we will not address all of them due to time constraints or questions that are outside the scope of today's presentation. I'll start with the first question. And that is, how did you know who were the right industry groups to bring to the table?
I'll start out. I think from my perspective, actually the automobile groups proactively reached out to us at EPA. And so we have been looking at source control and pollution prevention measures as an important component to really addressing stormwater pollution. And we had specifically been interested in looking for solutions for actually reducing the pollutants from coming into contact with the stormwater in the first place. So we had been interested in like more national approaches to eliminate the need for local governments, industry groups, and others to have to broach these issues alone. So it didn't take a lot of convincing for us to realize this was a really great beneficial partnership that could be formed for us at the federal level, but also on behalf of all of those other local governments and state governments around the country, and how wonderful a model this could be. So I think, you know, looking at what the issue was and realizing that it took sort of a large range of different industry groups, I think that the industry themselves sort of came to us with the right mix of people, which is really great. And I'll pause there to see if others have anything to add.
Yeah, Rachel, this is Lee. I would say initially we were inspired by the lead weight MOU that was signed with EPA and other signatories on reducing lead weights that were used on wheels and wheel ends for balance. Now, it's an old issue. It's like from many years ago. I'm probably even dating myself talking about it, but that was the one of the inspirations, frankly, for going this route.
Yeah, this is Aaron. I just add that a lot of the groups were already working together in California, Washington with regulatory agencies, and this was a natural progression. So we already had been working together with the various distribution groups to make this happen.
Oh, thank you all. The next question is, how did manufacturers figure out what to replace copper and the other pollutants with?
Laurie, would you like me to take this one?
Sure.
So it's not a one-for-one issue. As I indicated earlier, being a composite material, and it's a formula, it's a recipe, if you will. So just like recipes vary and you get different results, so do brake pad formulations. And so initially, finding that or needing to find replacements for copper to get those performance characteristics and safety characteristics that the manufacturers are looking for is a process. So of course, we're not privy to the formulations and the recipe, if you will. But the fact is it takes time to study it, evaluate, research it, test it, validate it, et cetera. So as Laurie explained, the industry spent a significant amount of resources trying to find those replacements, and it's going to vary depending again on the application and performance criteria.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is, with the state regulations and MOU in effect at the B level, and many new vehicles already compliant with the N level goal, are you already seeing reductions in copper levels in the critical watersheds? Approximately what level of reduction is expected long term?
I can take this one. Unfortunately, we don't have like a big analysis that's been completed, and we do recognize that a lot of times also when you're dealing with an effort that's on a large scale like this, it might take some time until you can actually see changes in the water body and in samples collected. But I think inherently as part of this, as the new brake pads are being installed and used in the automobiles, that we'll start to see a lowering of the copper, both in the stormwater itself that's coming off of the roads and in the water bodies as well. But I don't have any statistics on that as of yet.
Thank you. The next question is, based on this experience, what advice would you have to industry or to government bodies considering voluntary partnerships related to other products that contain stormwater pollutants?
I can start this one too, and then I guess you can chime in with your industry perspectives and state perspective too, as you wish. I think that there are a lot of great benefits. So I would say I'd sort of encourage people to reach out to regulators and talk about things. If you think that there's an approach that might work and you can do it more on a voluntary effort, I think that that's something that most people would be open to listening to and considering. So I'd just say I'd encourage you to strike up a dialogue. I think that as you see here, it's been extremely beneficial for us at the national scale, and I imagine that's true of other scales as well. Anyone else have anything?
This is Don Welsh at ECOS. I'll kind of echo what Rachel just said. Aaron pointed out that a lot of groups were already working together in the industry groups to try to address this problem. And for regulators, we have some tools that we can use to require people to do things, but those tools are often resource intensive, and they have a tendency to generate conflict. So if an industry group is committed to trying to reduce whatever the pollutant issue that they're dealing with, the states would certainly look forward to the opportunity to be able to sit down and come up with a voluntary way of doing that, because frequently the environmental result that you get comes at a much lower cost when you're partnering with someone who already wants to solve a problem, rather than when you're trying to chase around somebody who doesn't want to solve a problem and force them to do it. So it's certainly a benefit for the states to be able to get their job done, to be able to partner with people who are willing to work on those voluntary forward-looking programs. So stand up and volunteer, and most of the time I think you'll find a welcome from the state that you're talking to.
And I think too, just to add on top of that as well, like these sorts of voluntary approaches that are geared toward source control or pollution prevention, a lot of times that's a good way to approach the issue, because it's changing the constituents in a way that you reduce the problem that's occurring. And so it takes a little bit away from the individual people managing the stormwater from needing to actually like install a lot of controls in order to deal with it. Instead, you're just taking that and out of the stormwater in the first place. So it's a really good benefit from that standpoint as well.
Great, thank you. Moving on to the next question. How do you differentiate copper due to brake pad degeneration versus local soils and naturally attenuating copper due to geologic erosional processes? Is there a way to pinpoint whether copper concentrations can be definitively delineated to copper containing brake pads versus erosional deposits or depositions?
That's a great question, but I don't know that I have an answer. I don't know if anybody else would.
I guess it was a good question. We received a couple of questions that came in on whether imported copper brakes are included. Can you speak to whether there are guidelines for imported brake pad materials and if they are the same for domestic?
So the MOU focused on domestic brake pads. I don't think that we have fully addressed that through this effort since we were working together, but Lee, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, any pad sold in the states of California and Washington have to meet those requirements. So part of our industry effort was to do outreach in the brake community for all manufacturers to make them aware of this. And they also, if they do sell in Washington or California, particularly in Washington, they do have to register their product through the registrar. And so as a result, there is a international endeavor, if you can characterize it that way, in the sense that we have a national MOU to voluntarily not have these products sold, but it is dictated by the state requirements for sell and sell through dates, which are outlined in the MOU in more detail.
Great, thank you. The next question is, how are parties tracking copper reductions in overall ambient environmental improvements?
So I'd say we do have like data on copper and other constituents that are, like I mentioned, captured through other programs at EPA and the water bodies themselves. I think it has been tricky because there's so many different factors that would go into really tracking a reduction like this on a national scale to get all of that squared away. So we're not there yet, I would say, but it's not that we're not interested or looking into it. I think hopefully over time, as that data and body of research is being collected, we would be able to track and see these improvements a little bit more succinctly. And Don, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
No, I'm not aware of the specific collection of data to address that, but clearly it's important that we do measure the success in the environment rather than just measure the bureaucratic success of moving a problem along. So I know that states will be looking at being able to monitor that and be able to report on the progress, particularly the states, California and Washington, that were particularly interested in addressing the issue.
Yeah, and I think Don and I both are probably aware of certain watersheds that have been well researched, and there's a lot of monitoring occurring in those. So I think like thinking through that as well, trying to see if you can really suss out some of the changes more on a local scale is being looked at too.
Thank you. The next question is, are retailers, mechanic shops, etc., required to not sell or install brake pads for which the sell-through date has passed? What do they do with these expired, unused pads? Can retailers return them for credit on newer pads?
I think this is Aaron. I think that how they handle the brake pad, the non-compliant brake pads would depend on their relationship with their vendors. I wouldn't be able to specifically comment on that, but generally they shouldn't be selling, brake pads shouldn't be sold that are beyond the sell-through dates. So if for in Washington State and Oregon particularly. But they're fairly sizable. So in California, for instance, and if I'm wrong, Lee, let me know, but you can sell brake pads for use on cars that were produced previous to the model year when the requirement went in place. You can sell brake pads that are not complying. And then in Washington State, I believe it's 10-year sell-through date after the compliance date for not complying brake pads that are on the shelf, not produced.
Thank you. Next question is, there are a few different questions that came in on the replacement materials. So generally speaking, would someone like to speak about what we know about what's in the reformulated brake materials or how they are designed, and anything that can be shared about the life cycle costs to the consumer?
I mean, like I said earlier, these formulations are proprietary recipes, if you will, that each manufacturer has for their customers, whether they're for an aftermarket customer or for an OE automaker. So it's going to depend. And in terms of the types of materials, I mean, there is a SAE standard that was developed as part of our collaborative effort with California and Washington during the regulatory phase of that to test for the initial baseline testing that was required in Washington State to test other constituents so that if there is a period in time down the road where we can make sure that those constituents aren't increasing. But in terms of what replacement for copper, it could vary. It really depends on the, we don't have a brake engineer on the line with us, but we are not privy to that. We as a trade association are not privy to that information. But in terms of monitoring, that's part of what the anticipated baseline testing was for in the state of Washington. So there is definitely a mind's eye to ensuring that whatever is replacing is not going to have residual issues down the road. And that is the commitment that we made in this national MOU to make this nationwide so that we can, from our domestic manufacturer standpoint and what's sold here domestically in the United States, that is the aim. Lori, I don't know if you had anything to add to that, or Aaron even, but that is how some of that played out in the early days of our dialogue with the states.
I think that's a good summary, Lee.
I mean, that's part of why it was, you know, we needed the phase in to accommodate the time and opportunity to test and look at different materials.
And I think that's also too, like, why it was important that all of us came together, because you know, we talked about things like that early on, that you'd need this time in order to do the research and make sure that your replacement wasn't going to cause unanticipated consequences for both the brake pad itself and for, you know, what we were trying to achieve at EPA, the reduction of, you know, pollutants in stormwater.
Thank you. The next question is, what has been the response of those who install brakes to new replacement products? If that information is known.
Yeah, I can only say that we have not really heard complaints at this point about the new brakes that are being put on cars. I mean, it appears to be working, and I think that the best test is if cars are operating properly with those brakes and people aren't complaining.
Thank you.
I'm just kind of chuckling to myself because I'm envisioning myself the next time I buy a car asking them about the brake pads on it and confusing a few people.
Moving on to the next question, it is, do you think cost, dependence, and competition with other industries on the material could be impacted by the alignment of the companies to the regulation?
To be honest, I don't even know that I understand this question. So
Would you like me to reread it?
no, I'm looking at, I can see the question. I'm not sure I understand it's not clear to me what other industries on the material. I'm not sure what they're talking about.
Well,
Yeah, I
guess
apologize.
no worries. I can move on to the next question. Has the reduction of copper content in the brake pads affected the service life of the pads?
I mean, again, that's service life of pads. You can average it out, but it's going to really depend. It's on how it's used in the real world, and we don't have real world content or data. That's just not something we have. But I mean, I don't know that, you know, part of any brake pad, where is you want the most durability and wear from each pad. So again, when they're looking for the reformulations, they're ensuring that that reformulation has the same performance characteristics. I know I probably sound like a broken record, but that really is the driver, is to ensure that it meets the performance characteristics that are desirable by the customer, and that it, you know, stops the vehicle as part of the stopping distance requirements, which are federal motor vehicle safety standards.
Oh, thank you. Moving on, the next question is, what incentives did manufacturers have to comply with the MOU?
This is Aaron. I think one incentive that was brought up early in the presentation is the fact of having one standard nationwide, instead of having to worry about states providing going their own direction on a copper brake standard. The importance to having a national standard, I can't overstate that. It's just so important to their supply chain to be able to get the parts to the right place. Having different requirements in every state creates so many bottlenecks for the manufacturers and the distributors. So that alone is a major incentive to having one standard and meeting the MOU.
Yep, and this is Laurie with MEMA. I completely agree with Aaron. You know, that's that slide that we had on the industry perspective and the motivation and the lessons learned and the benefits. Aaron laid that out, is that it was so important that we communicated to the states across the country that we were going to be meeting that nationwide. Also, you know, manufacturers can't manufacture brakes just for Washington and just for California. So if we're going to be meeting those standards, it just makes sense to meet them nationwide. And that's what we wanted to make clear in the MOU.
Great, thank you. The next question is, does this apply to OHV for using these newer brake pads?
I don't know what that stands for.
I unfortunately also do not know.
Yeah, that was my question. Is it on highway vehicles or off highway vehicles?
Oh, it looks like off-highway vehicles.
Actually, I don't think it applies to off highway vehicles.
No.
That's right. There's exemptions in the regulations.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Are the studies and data of the effects of copper on the environment available to the public?
Can you repeat that again? I'm sorry.
Sure. It is, are the studies and data of the effects of copper on the environment available to the public?
I think that they're in various journal articles. So those would be available to the public, yes.
Great.
But I don't have like a compilation of things myself to like hand out.
Yeah, the states of Washington and California on their brakes regulations pages, I believe, do have some links to data and analysis that they've done.
Got it. Thank you. The next question is, well, I see that there are a couple questions about looking at other stormwater pollutants related to vehicle components and whether similar partnerships will be established to address those. If anyone would care to comment on that.
I mean, I think that if there are other industries that similarly work or have products that they think some component may need to be adjusted or reformulated, I think, you know, out of this effort, I think it's a good thing to discuss. And I'd encourage people to reach out to folks like Don and I had said earlier, reach out to the states or to us at EPA and strike up a dialogue about it. I think we're open to discussing these sorts of things with any and everyone who would want to do so.
Thanks. And the next question is, if the state of California uses the model year of the vehicle to determine compliance with the brake regulations, how does it apply these rules to commercial or heavy-duty vehicles, which do not use model years to catalog their parts, but rather the axle manufacturer and the size of the brake?
So, Zach, I would just say we're at 3 o'clock, and that's a very complicated question, which has a very complicated answer. But the fact is, there are exemptions in both states, and the whole model year issue with California is a slight misunderstanding, frankly, of how this is going to play out. So again, I would just refer everybody to review and read the MOU. And then, of course, if you have questions, I would certainly direct any specific questions either to the state regulators or Rachel at EPA, or Laurie, me, Aaron. You can contact any one of us, but we are at time.
Incidentally, that was also our last question. And I'd just like to remind everyone that a copy of the accessible recording of this webinar will be posted at the link on this slide. That being said, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your questions. We hope you've enjoyed today's presentation and look forward to sharing more information as this effort continues to progress. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.